Given the anniversary of the D-Day landings in 1944 on June 6th, I wanted to make a little mini-series for you, where besides the day-to-day events from June 1, I wanted to show you what the Allies actually were facing. Now, you have all heard of the bunkers, the machine guns, the mines, and you have all seen Saving Private Ryan a million times, I'm sure. But do you really know what the places were behind the pictures of the broken guns? What did the Germans actually build? How and what was their plan? Over the next couple of weeks, I will show you from the ground as I visited some of the more interesting parts of the Atlantic Wall, or rather, the fortified strongpoints along the coast. On paper, the German strength to position looked good, with roughly 1 million men, 900,000 of them combat troops, for the defense of Western Europe. But they also had 2,400 kilometers of coastline to defend, with 58 divisions in the west, and 4 armies, 2 army groups B and G, one commanded by Rommel, the other by Blaskowitz. Many of these were by 1944 significantly depleted. A German division typically had 15,000 men, now only had 6 battalions, some of these padded by Osttruppen, whereas in 1939 they would have had 9. And many of these were static divisions. Germany now basically mirrored that of pre-World War II French troop depositions by placing a string of defenses which could be defended by older or lesser trained convalescent troops, defending more with less men and material, the concept behind the Maginot Line. And I want to show you exactly what it was the Germans did for the defense of Normandy. What exactly was the Allies facing when they crossed the Channel? You've all seen these photos of the select bunkers, you've heard the exploits on the beaches, and you know of the logistic success of the pre-invasion assembly of masses of material, and it was. But do you really know how the German defenses worked? What these individual points of resistance were, how they fought, and how they ended? Well, in this little Normandy series, I will show you. In return, I hope you will consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you. The German strategy for the defense of Normandy in 1944 was designed to repel an anticipated Allied invasion of Western Europe. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel empathized a forward defense to stop the invasion at and on the beaches, supported by fortified bunkers, gun positions, artillery. However, the German strategy was not unified. Von Rundstedt was favoring allowing the landing, then rushing a heavy counterattack and destroy them on the beaches. So you already had a general conflict of defensive aims and tactics. That was a problem. But for now, I will focus on Rommel's task in that of creating defenses to his aim of denying a landing in the first place. He had seen at first hand how Allied air power dominated and had haunted him towards the end in Africa, and he knew the Allied here would have air supremacy. And thus, during daylight, it would become impossible to move, thus the assets had to be in place when an invasion would begin, and hit the Allies at the most vulnerable. He wanted the supreme defense, and preferable the German tank corps, in place to counterattack immediately. Also, Rundstedt wanted the armor far inland in a central place from where they could deploy in the directions of the landings, preparing for defense in depth. This would prove to be a serious problem, as it turned out. For the concepts of construction of their defenses and the overall defensive plan, I will focus on Normandy's fortifications, the bunkers, gun positions, the artillery. Especially, we will visit Pointe du Hoc, Massy, Lons-sur-Mer, Crispec, and Asville as typical points of defense at that time and place. Some of these were rather simplistic, and others the most modern in German defensive concepts at the time. The defense of Normandy would fall under Army Group B, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, with the 7th Army under General Friedrich Dollmann responsible for the region. The 352nd and the 716th Infantry Division, supported by Kriegsmarine artillery units, who manned key positions. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was the commander, CNC West. The German 15th Army was the strongest unit in France, but due to the Allied deception, it was stationed in Pas-de-Calais, which was very, very well prepared, however. Now, two things need to be remembered. Only 20% of the planned defenses had been completed, and the Germans had a significant deficit in manpower due to the Russian front situation. With that in mind, the way the Germans constructed the defenses was done in stages. After the Battle of France was over, planning for defending the gained territory now began. The first suitable landing places was identified. Thereafter, the Germans placed anything which could hurl a projectile around that place in open positions. French, Czech cannons, even guns from World War I, anything. Even steel domes from the Maginot Lines were put in place, or French tank turrets were put in stationary bunkers. After that, as resources would become available, both modern weaponry, cement, steel, the positions would be built up gradually, bunker by bunker, cement-reinforced trench, firing stand, ringstand by ringstand. Each established key position for defense would be upgraded every year. Now remember, this was across the entire 2,400-kilometer frontier. You often has heard that this or that German position was still under construction when it was attacked. This was the case. Construction plans and resources had already been allocated for 1945 and on. So one thing is that what the Allies actually attacked, another is what they would have attacked a month or a year later. But a standard disposition would be, first the Germans would identify a point to defend. This would be a place it would be easy or conceivable for the Allies to land an invasion force. Then they would place 4 of the heaviest guns they could find, preferably over 10 centimeters, place them first in open positions. They then started building crew bunkers. Then flak guns would come, munition bunkers, and so on. Then the guns would be encased, if possible, and the trenches run between all of these, whereafter the trenches would then be covered themselves, followed by more guns, mines, barbed wire. Rommel would order placements of millions of mines along the coast, and also Rommel's asparagus, as they were called, which was heavy wooden stakes to impale or impede gliders, and underwater obstacles, hedgehogs, Belgian gates to block landing crafts. Most of the coastal batteries were 155mm, 150 or 105mm guns, and of course lots and lots of machine gun nests with MG-34s or 42s, and even some Maxims captured by the French, placed into brooks. These were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire as well as mutual support. Now, the strong points, Widerstandsnest, are those interesting positions or strong points I want to focus on and show you. And for a moment, remember the centralized forts of pre-World War I, the Brelmont forts, for instance, where a relatively small area was fenced in, big guns placed in the center, machine guns on the perimeter for defense. I've showed you lots of these over the years, but for a minute keep that concept in mind. Now, key positions like Macy or Pointe du Hoc was organized as resistance nests, combining artillery, infantry, anti-aircraft defenses, and to hold out against assaults until reinforcements arrived. Each of these strong points were semi-autonomous, with bunkers, trenches, supplies, and munition to withstand prolonged attacks or even sieges. That sounds a lot like the World War I forts, doesn't it? Now imagine a string of those along the coast, and you get the picture. Of course, you insert tons and landmines and AA guns everywhere as well. Normandy was not a string of bunkers, but a string of strong points. Now, of course, the Germans would also use deception, fake gun positions, fake steel domes. I'll show you one of those later. Famously, how we all now know that the guns of Pointe du Hoc, short of one, had been replaced by wooden logs. Now the Luftwaffe had problems. They were severely weakened by 1944, although the production of aircraft was up, the delivery of fuel was down. And with only 319 aircraft available in France on D-Day, versus the roughly 10,000 Allied planes, anti-aircraft guns, 88s and 20mm flak mostly, at batteries like the Massy and Long-sur-Mer were critical, and they did take their toll on Allied ground attack aircraft. But with that kind of numbers, camouflage was one of the last keys to survival, and some of the German positions were exceptionally well camouflaged, either as buildings or to blend in with nature. I'll show you examples of this, and some of that would fool Allied interpreters of aerial reconnaissance. Now, all of the positions I will show you was known by Allied intelligence, and all of them were bombed leading up to D-Day and on the night of. However, when the ships arrived, they were all operational. Some of them lasted until the 9th or 10th of June, so they could certainly take punishment well, despite of their bombing. At 5:30 a.m., batteries like Krischbeck, Long-sur-Mer, and Massy opened fire on Allied ships, with Pointe du Hoc's guns already having been relocated inland. The German alarm was raised after Krischbeck's rangefinder spotted the fleet. The German construction concept for Normandy's defenses was standardized under the Todt organization, usual Regelbauten, standardized bunker design, to create resilient and connected strongpoints that were simple to construct. A heavy crew shelter could be constructed in about a week, for instance. In this way, the commander of a section or a fortress could submit plans for his expansion for the following year. For instance, if he would like to build 4 more Tobruks for close defense, he would like to encase his guns, and like to build 2 more reinforced crew shelters. He would submit this to the organization Todt after approval by his higher-ups, and the organization Todt would know exactly how much cement and wood and rebar they would have to send him. The construction crews would know exactly how long it would take to build, and exactly how long it would take for the cement to dry before they could move on to the next evolution. This was incredibly smartly done, and incidentally some of the wooden barracks were also standardized, like a huge fortified IKEA catalog. In many of the Western-occupied countries, it was quite normal for Organization Todt or the German army itself to hire local workers or local construction companies to aid in their building programs. However, they were apprised of the concept of the French resistance, thus especially in France they would try to not use French contract workers in order to maintain secrecy and prevent the resistance from leaking, bombing, or destroying their work site. So they would use many of Soviet, Polish, Czech prisoners for that labor construction, or even German workers brought over from Germany. And then, of course, there was the problem of bombing disruption. With a large number of the AA guns now having to be placed in Germany proper to defend against Allied air raids, and the Air Force in general being placed in Russia, where 80% of all German assets were at any given time, the Allies' air forces would gradually take over, and bombing raids would take place the minute they would discover something interesting was being constructed. However, in April alone, over 1,000 tons of bombs was dropped on Pointe du Hoc alone. And yet, the one gun left there behind found on D-Day was operational. Also, there was severe lack of materials, which delayed construction and reinforcement, leaving many of the guns along the coast still in open emplacements. The earliest construction phases from 1941 to 42 would focus on site selection and basic fortifications, such as the coastal cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, Long-sur-Mer, and the inland rises of Massy and Asville. They were chosen for the strategic advantages. Open emplacements for guns, like 155mm at Pointe du Hoc, a 105 at Asville, and the initial trenches were constructed here using forced labor. For example, the Krischbeck began with open pits for 2 10mm guns, with foundations laid later in 1941. Then in 42-43, the main phases, the Regelbaut casemates of the H671, M272, and R683 were constructed to protect the guns, with concrete pouring prioritized for the key batteries. Fire control bunkers were also added for precise targeting, such as at Lons-sur-Mer. The extensive trench networks. At Macy, there's 2.5 miles of it. Asville had 1 kilometer of covered trenches by the war's end. And defensive features, lots of Tobruks and minefields, were also expanded, of course. And then there was the camouflage. It became extremely critical as Allied air raids increased. Macy's netting and Pointe-du-Hoc's decoys were implemented. In 43-44, which became the final phase, Rommel's inspection tours, late 43, accelerated fortification efforts, adding beach obstacles and reinforcing batteries further. However, material shortage and bombing halted much progress. Also at this time, the 155mm guns at Pointe-du-Hoc was moved inland unbeknownst to Allied intelligence, and decoys were used to counter this. By June 1944, many batteries, like Macy and Asville, had incomplete casemates, with guns in open pits, vulnerable to naval fire, and only a few of them had been completed or encased. However, Asville was almost completed by 1944 June. Thus, the German defensive plan for Normandy was to integrate static coastal fortifications, or small strongpoints, with limited mobile reserves, aiming to repel the invasion at the water's edge while preparing for counterattacks. Batteries were designed to operate autonomously, with supplies and shelters to withstand prolonged assaults until the panzer reinforcements would arrive. Obviously, we know what the end result was, but, taken individually, there were successes. Batteries like Macy or Krischbeck disrupted Allied landings, with Macy shelling Omaha for 3 days, and Krischbeck sinking a destroyer. The fortifications also withstood heavy bombardment. Pointe-du-Hoc's casemates survived 1,000 tons of bombs, and they did delay Allied advances somewhat. However, the overall failures were that there was incomplete fortifications. The Macy had open gun emplacements, and the gun relocation at Pointe-du-Hoc would reduce the actual firepower landing on the beaches. Allied air and naval superiority overwhelmed the coastal guns, with Lons-sur-Mer and Pointe-du-Hoc neutralized within 24 hours. The panzer delays and Fortitude's deception prevented effective counterattacks, allowing the Allies to secure the beachheads by June 7th to 12th. The German strategy for Normandy in 1944 centered on a forward defense to repel the invasion at the beachheads, using coastal artillery batteries, beach obstacles, and strongpoints, with the limited mobile reserves for counterattack. The construction concepts relied on the Regelbauten, standardized bunkers and casemates and trenches, built with reinforced concrete and camouflage to withstand bombing. Pointe-du-Hoc, Macy, Lons-sur-Mer, Krischbeck, Asville exemplifies this approach, which is why I want you to see them in detail. With the robust fortifications, but incomplete works due to the resource constraint and Allied raids, the plan faded due to the Allied firepower, the intelligence gaps, and the delays in reserves showing up. Though the batteries caused significant disruption, they fought heroically. Macy's post-war obscurity highlights ongoing debates about D-Day's priorities. But the German defensive plan, while it was formidable, could not overcome the Allies' overwhelming resources. "You cannot fight everyone everywhere at the same time," said someone very clever with a really cool hat. And now, in the next episodes, we will go through all of these individual positions and cover their story and development and fall.
My name is Tino Struckmann. I run Lost Battlefields. Every year, I travel around the world to try to bring you to all the most interesting historical military locations from modern wars and the World War II special projects, battlefields, forts, fortresses, and tunnels, everything else. Things you may not be able to see or go to yourselves. Please join me on Patreon or join Lost Battlefields through the website so you get access to all my files and my notes. It really does help, and like, follow, share here on the channel if you can. That helps too.